Chapter 2, Merribeth. "Lucas, are you ready yet?" Merribeth poked her head out of the kitchen and looked down the short hallway toward Lucas's room. "I can't find my shoes." Her son's tender voice carried out of his room. Merribeth rolled her eyes and sighed. She didn't have time for this, but she should have expected it. Losing his shoes or his socks was a regular occurrence for Lucas. Actually, he didn't so much lose them as he covered them up with something on the floor and then never managed to look under that thing. She was sure it had more to do with his age than anything. At least, she hoped. She loved her son, but this daily chore of chasing down his lost articles of clothing or pointing out clothing that was in front of his face was definitely getting old. She stepped into the living room and found one shoe sitting in front of the couch. Picking it up, she scanned the rest of the room, but there were no more shoes. The bathroom, then? Had he taken the other one off before his bath last night? Why he couldn't take them off in the same place was beyond her. But she trudged that direction, sure that it would be there. Sure enough, the other shoe was in the tiny bathroom that served as both his bathroom and the one guests would use, if she ever had guests over. She must have been too tired after his bath to notice it last night. "Here, Lucas," she said, holding out the shoes to him as she entered his room. He crawled out from under his bed and looked at her with his big brown eyes that always reminded her of Colin. "Thanks, Mom." "You're welcome." She set the shoes down on his Batman bedspread. "Can you please hurry and finish getting dressed? I need to pack my lunch." "Sure, Mom, but can we go to the park today?" "Not today, buddy. I have to work, but it's almost the weekend. We can go then." As long as she didn't get called into work on Saturday. She'd heard rumors that the lodge had hired a new manager. Who knew what that meant? Would he or she honor her schedule? Would she even still have a job? Her job at the resort had been secure the last few years. She'd made sure to work hard and prove her worth. But she'd worked enough other jobs to know that new managers sometimes meant shakeups. She shook her head as she reached the kitchen. No, she couldn't think about that. They were already living paycheck to paycheck and barely making ends meet. There was no way they would be able to live if she lost her job. Thankfully, she'd qualified for a low-income preschool for Lucas. That would help free up a few $100s a month. Unfortunately, they didn't have a spot for another few weeks, so she had to make it until then. After taking the bread and peanut butter from the pantry, she grabbed the jelly from the bare fridge and whipped up yet another PB&J. She was tired of the simple lunch, but it was cheap. A trip to the grocery store was definitely on her to-do list when she got paid again. When the sandwich was finished, she dropped it in a Ziploc bag, the same one from yesterday, as they were too expensive to throw away every day, and then added a banana. It wasn't much, but if she was lucky, there would be leftover food at the resort, and she could grab a few bites. She checked her watch as she dropped the sandwich and banana into her purse. Time had gotten away from her, and they needed to head out of the house now if she had any hope of making it to work on time. "Lucas, let's go." He appeared as she reached the front door. His shirt sported a few unsightly stains, but there was no time to change. At least he had his shoes on the right feet. A small sigh escaped her lips. "Come on, buddy." Though she was not sad that Colin was no longer in the picture, raising her son as a single mother was certainly harder than she'd ever expected. She buckled Lucas in, whispering a silent prayer for his safety and her sanity as she shut the door and climbed in behind the steering wheel of the powder blue 1984 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. The car had been a present from her father before he passed, but not one that she loved. He'd said he wanted her in a safe vehicle, one that he knew would protect Lucas even if they got into an accident. The car was definitely big and safe. It felt like a giant boat to Merribeth. But it had one very finicky habit. On occasion, especially cold morning occasions, which were quite often in Colorado in December, it refused to start unless she popped open the hood and jammed a screwdriver into the carburetor. Her father had promised to get the car looked at when she'd informed him of the problem, but he'd had a stroke 2 days later and never recovered. Now Merribeth neither had the time nor the money to fix the car. Whispering another prayer that the car would start, she turned the key and sighed with relief when the engine turned over. After checking the rearview mirror, she backed out of the drive and headed into town. 10 minutes later, she pulled into the drive of Edith Biggs' house. Edith was not Merribeth's favorite person, nor was she her first choice in a child care provider, but she had been the cheapest in town. Now Merribeth knew why. Not only did Edith rarely smile, but she felt that it was her right to badger the parents about anything she thought they weren't doing correctly. In Merribeth's case, that happened to be a lot, but first and foremost on Edith's list was the fact that Merribeth was raising her son alone. Merribeth could count on one hand the days she'd managed to either drop Lucas off or pick him up without Edith giving her some lecture on the importance of a father in a young boy's life. Sure enough, Edith stood on the front porch in her faded flannel robe and wearing the same annoyed expression that graced her face every day. Her hands were shoved deep into her thick hips, and rollers still resided in her graying hair. "Come on, Lucas." Merribeth forced enthusiasm she didn't feel into her voice as she unbuckled her son and hoisted him out of the car. With his little hand in hers, they traversed slowly up the cold sidewalk, taking care not to slip. Edith didn't believe in salting the walk, and Merribeth had no doubt she would not chip in on medical bills if someone slipped and fell. The sagging porch was only slightly less slick, and Merribeth held on to the railing for extra support. She knew the inside of the house was more welcoming, but she was still glad he would be changing centers at the beginning of the new year. As they reached the top step, Lucas pulled on her hand and looked up at her with sad eyes. "Mom, do I have to go in?" "You do, buddy, but I'll be back to pick you up as soon as I'm done today." She gave him a fierce hug and whispered in his ear, "Maybe I can sneak some dessert for you tonight." It wasn't much, but she hoped it gave him something to look forward to. Sure enough, a twinkle sparked in his brown eyes, and a hint of a smile appeared. "With chocolate?" "I'll do my best." He gave her another squeeze, and then hurried past Edith with lightning speed, disappearing into the house. Edith folded her arms across her chest and fixed Merribeth with her signature belittling stare. "You know he needs a man in his life. When are you going to get back together with his father?" "I'm not, Edith." She was not only tired of having the conversation with Edith, but she had no time today. Lucas's father was no role model, and I know it's hard on him right now, but if he's going to have a man in his life, I want it to be a good one. With that, she issued a curt nod and turned back toward her car. "Any man's influence is better than no influence at all," Edith called as Merribeth walked away. She shook her head as she opened the driver's door and slid in. Not only were the words not true, but they were said in judgment by a woman who had obviously never had a bad man in her life. Merribeth tried to believe the woman's intentions were good, even if her delivery was lacking. She knew that God wanted families together, but she also knew that abuse was a repeated pattern. Those who saw it at home while growing up were more likely to do it themselves when they got older. And while Colin had never hit her, his words had done damage. That was not the life she wanted for Lucas. For what seemed like the millionth time that week, she sent a silent prayer to God for help. Help with her job, help with her finances, and help in finding a good father figure for Lucas. She knew God worked in his own time, but she sure hoped his time collided with hers soon. After a final glance in the rearview mirror, Merribeth steered the car toward the Patriot Peak Resort.